Just loading. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to round 4 of the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research Debating Championships 2021. There we go, a bit of a mouthful. This is the 4th round, and what I'll do is get teams to go affirmative negating and just state your name and then your gender pronoun if you would like to. So, affirmative team.
I'm Eva, I'm first speaker, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm Sophie, I'm second speaker, and I have she, her pronouns. I'm Cara, I'm third speaker, and I have she, her pronouns.
Awesome. And the negating team, please.
Hi, I'm Isaac, he, him.
Hi, I'm Lisa, she, her.
I'm Jack, here.
Awesome. And just the panel super quickly, if you guys don't mind.
John and no preference.
No preference.
Kia ora whanau, ko Clearline take it ingoa, no preference.
Awesome. The motion today is this House would permanently abolish the Olympics. Without further ado, if everyone's ready to start, I'd like to call out the first speaker, Eva, to open the affirmative case.
In 2016, before the Brazilian government hosted the Rio Olympics, they bulldozed the favela area of the city so they could have a new direct train line from the airport to a stadium. That's the type of harm the Olympics causes, and that's what we're talking about abolishing today. We're going to prove to you, firstly, that the Olympics has failed fundamentally in its goal of worldwide unity and of world sport, and also that it causes active harm, and that's why we're abolishing it today. A couple arguments for this. Firstly, how this is severely harmful to the host country and why this means we can't continue to host it. And secondly, why it has failed in this goal of global unity and why that means we can't continue to host it. Firstly, I'd just like to offer some characterization of the Olympics and talk about why they are so uniquely different from any other sporting event. Firstly, it is because of the scale, obviously, right? This is all the nations in the world, essentially, this is all the sports. But also, it has thousands of years of gravitas. It's got a lot of, it's more of an institution rather than just a sporting tournament, right? It is different to every other sporting event because of this massive history and because of all the prestige that this entails. Okay, so having established that, let's look at some of the harms that the Olympics causes. So my first substantive is going to discuss how this is significantly harmful to countries who host this and why that is so bad. So if we look at the process for agreeing to host the Olympics, these countries put in a bid to host the Olympics to the ICO, a bid that cost them billions of dollars, whatever, 10 years before the games take place, right? These countries are sometimes poor or developing and sometimes have these issues that are going to hamper them in this goal. Okay, why do countries want to host? So there's a couple reasons, but one of the underlying ones is that hosting the Olympics is a kind of international flex, right? Showing how cool and developed you are and how cool your stadiums are and how good you are at hosting stuff. That's the incentive operating among a lot of these countries to host an event like this, is to show off how developed and how good and great they are, right? This results in a number of harms that don't outweigh any of the benefits of the Olympics. First one is human rights abuses, right? This is a really significant harm brought to you today. Some countries will commit human rights abuses, and we've seen this in the past, and this will always exist in the Olympics, and I'll tell you why. When either they do it because they think it's going to give their country a good image or a better image that they want to be putting out, or if they just think it is going to be easier to do it that way. Right, we saw this in Brazil, as I told you in my introduction. I'll take you in a second, when they literally bulldozed favelas, so they didn't have the slum area of their country, so that looked nicer for them being able to build this airport line. People lost their homes, their livelihoods, your life is over if your house just gets destroyed by your government in the name of some international sports competition. I'll take your point.
When the Olympics give so much international visibility that these human rights abuses are actually boycotted during the Olympics, why is this an inherent harm?
Okay, so it's a second mechanism, but I'll get to it now, of why these human rights abuses are actually covered up. If a country is going to be hosting an international game, they're going to have a direct incentive operating upon them to keep these human rights abuses or whatever away from the spotlight as much as possible. If there is conversation already happening worldwide about human rights abuses in a country, and that country is going to host the Olympics, they're going to cover them up, and people are going to come back from the Olympics going, I don't know what anyone was talking about, there was nothing going on there, and that conversation gets immediately shut down. Maybe, hundreds of years ago, it was a good way to do it. In the 21st century, in the age where you can literally just cover anything up, it is not a viable way to expose human rights abuses. We tell you that we have far better channels to do that through like independent journalism and like good monitoring and stuff. A sports competition where they can literally cover it up and they have an incentive to do that is not the right way. Yeah, and so they also do this just to like protect their image, right? Like when Russia was hosting it a few years ago, they just like cleaned out this particular town of like all people who like aligned with like LGBTQ and stuff. Like they're really, really harmful stuff, like ruining people's lives in the name of international unity. We can't stand for this, and this will always happen with the Olympics because of this sense of international gravitas, because of this prestige. Where you have to project your country in the way you want it to be projected, and you have that incentive brought up in that POI to cover up those human rights abuses so you look so great and good. This will always happen with the Olympics, and we can't stand for this. Secondly, it creates massive economic harms upon these countries as well, right? You have to spend billions of dollars in infrastructure, and if you are a developing country, if you're a country who maybe has started an economic recession in like the 5 years since you made this bid, you are not going to be able to financially recover from this. This is billions of dollars that are coming in to build you like stadiums, train lines, hotels that are never going to be used and are never going to be benefited from after the Olympics are over. This tourism money that comes in is going to be a sugar hit that is going to dissipate the second the Olympics is over. And we think that this money would, like, if these countries want to appear developed and really good to the rest of the world, we think the same incentive is then operating upon them to put this money instead into tourism when the Olympics don't exist, which is going to be better long-term benefit for that country, or into like development, which again is going to be better. So at the end of this point, we know what's true is that there will always be human rights abuses when countries try to cover this up, and that sort of like random reporters during the Olympics uncovering human rights abuses is not an effective mechanism, and also that the economic harms are going to economically cripple this country, which is really, really important in terms of protecting the world from the Olympics today. So that's why we've got to abolish them on that front. Okay, secondly, why have the Olympics failed in the goal that we tell you that they were like set out to have? So we tell you that they wanted to have like international unity and like diversity and stuff like that. And they failed in that in 3 key aspects, which mean that they are not going to be, which mean that they need to be abolished. Firstly, the Olympics is effectively now, in the 21st century, a way for individual countries to flex their global power. This is because they have like 1 billion views compared to like maybe the FIFA World Cup, which is like 100 million. This is a way to show how great these countries are. This means the incentive operating upon these countries when they send these athletes off is just to be like, just to win, like at any cost, show how good we are in this particular aspect. They're willing to do whatever it takes, right? What this means is that we've seen a variety of things over the past 2 years of Olympics, which have directly undermined the integrity both of the competition and of sport, and undermined that goal of global unity. This looks like doping scandals. This looks like a bunch of really negative tensions that flare up between different groups who already have international tensions at these Olympics. Okay. This is really harmful because not only does it exacerbate these tensions, but it just creates a platform for this further stuff like the Russia doping scandal and harmful stuff like that. I'll take your point.
Okay, so how does your side get coverage for small sports that wouldn't get funding without the Olympics grabbing up?
Okay, so we think that like generally there are sports federations for most sports, right? But also we don't know how many people are exactly watching like niche croquet competitions at the Olympics anyway. And even if worldwide croquet doesn't get that much funding, we say that's not a massive harm compared to people literally having their homes bulldozed in the name of global sport, right? So we think there'll still be some funding, but even if there's not, it's not that big of a harm. Okay, so at the end of this point, we know that the Olympics promotes cheating and doping because again, there's that thing of anything to win at all costs, which isn't there in other sports competitions because of this gravitas and this prestige, and this will always happen under the Olympics, so it undermines the integrity of the sport and the goal of global unity in these competitions. We also know that this is really, really important for the need to be able to prove that the Olympics actually has maintained its integrity and its ability to achieve those goals of unity, and we also know that all the harms about human rights abuses and the massive economic devastation on these countries are way more important than whether or not handball gets more views.
I'd like to thank the speaker for this speech and will now invite up the first speaker from the debating team, NZ.
At a time more than ever when we have global divisions, when we have communities and countries not seeing each other face to face, the ability that the Olympics provides for cross-cultural understanding, for good diplomacy between countries is invaluable. That is what this debate is about. We're so proud to champion that. We're so proud to support this global progress. What do we specifically support? Firstly, keeping Olympics and the Paralympics. Secondly, we are happy to support the Olympic Committee starting to do things like assessing a country's ability to host the Olympics and the financial implications of doing so before allowing them to lodge a bid. We're also happy to support new ideas like cross-funding between countries, which helps lessen the financial burden on an individual host country. The unifying narrative of our case is that we protect an event that facilitates worldwide progress on social issues and avoid the disintegration of sports that would come with abolishing this truly global event. We're going to prove this through three substantives. Firstly, how the Olympics provides a clear platform for global change. Secondly, how this policy harms the sporting environment both globally and domestically in an individual country. And Hiso will split, telling you about how this specifically harms athletes. But before that, let's take a look at what we were offered by Side Ath. The first thing I want to point out is that they had a lack of modelling in today's debate because they didn't give us any idea about what they think is going to replace the Olympics. All they said was just, oh, there are already sporting organisations under the status quo, these will continue to exist. They fundamentally didn't engage with the fact that the Olympics has truly global influence, and by bringing so many sports together, it creates so much attention that you can't get just by having a specific equestrian championship. Those sports are often very centralised or in a European championship too and aren't truly global. They didn't tell us how they get quasi-Olympic events for individual sports under their side of the house. But what did they tell us? Their first key claim was that Brazil was really bad. It was bad for the economy. It was bad for the favelas. We want to prevent that in the future. A few responses to this. Firstly, we just tell you this isn't always the case. Brazil was an example where it was bad, but we tell you, we point to its success stories like London, where it has huge amounts of economic benefits, huge amount of tourist benefits. We think that those are most of the case. Secondly, we tell you this specifically be most of the case when we implement things like sustainability assessments for how well these countries are actually going to be able to cope with the financial burden of it, when we are eligible to implement things by cross-funding between multiple countries that reduces the financial burden that they wanted to talk about, allows them to enjoy more of their tourism benefits. Thirdly, we tell you we're actually able to learn from our mistakes that we've had in the past with cases like Rio. The fact that they spent that whole 8 minutes talking about Rio clearly shows that we have a big awareness of what went wrong. This is important for two reasons. Firstly, for individual countries, it's important because it's unlikely the developed country or a semi-developing country is going to go into something like Rio did now because they recognise how bad it was for them. They just said they want to flex. That's not good enough when they recognise that there's going to be such a bad impact for human development. We don't think that overpowers it. But secondly, we learn from our mistakes on the basis of the Olympic Committee. So it looks like things like the Olympic Committee saying we're going to build less stadiums for Olympics in the future, changing the way in which we host Olympics to make it more financially accessible. Finally, they said the Olympics has strayed away from its goals. They firstly said it's a way to flex global power. Quickly, we tell you, look, this happens with all sports like rugby, like cricket, like football. It's not exclusive to the Olympics. But secondly, they never explain why this exclusively was a bad thing. Cool, the US can win some gold medals. That doesn't change much. Secondly, they said it creates a win-at-all-costs mentality with doping. A couple of responses. Firstly, we're actually able to actively regulate it, and we don't think this happens to the majority of athletes, but we think when it does happen, we're able to pick it up when Russia's been excluded from the next Olympics. But secondly, we tell you it's a lot harder to take drugs at the Olympics because of the amount of anti-doping infrastructure that they have at a huge event like that. Much easier to do it at an individual, small sport European Championship that they want to support. Okay, let's take a look at our case, firstly on how we create a platform for global change. What's special about the Olympics that's different to just like an athletics World Cup? 3 things. Firstly, it gets wider coverage and more interest because of the amount of prestige it is and because it has multiple sports that interest a broad coalition of people. Secondly, more people actually attend the Olympics in person because it's actually a thing for people who have family vacations to go to the Olympics, to spend time around the village. That is a big tourist attraction, far more so than like an individual sporting event. Thirdly, we tell you it's a truly global event. It's not just a European or a Pan-American championship. It includes countries from Africa, Pacific, South America. It gets that truly global nature. How, therefore, can exclusively the Olympics lead to social change? Firstly, it allows for cross-cultural and cross-national bonds. On an individual level, when tourists are in the same Olympic city interacting with people of different cultures, or athletes are interacting with people from different cultures, it allows for relationships, for friendships, to cross national or ethnic lines. But if we look secondly at a macro level, we think like prime ministers attending the same event that both countries are good at, or cooperation between sporting programs that countries are both good at, leads to cross-national bonds that can reduce tensions and hostilities in international relations. Secondly, we tell you it provides an unparalleled platform for social change that creates progress on social issues like race, like disability, like poverty, because we think it gives Paralympians an opportunity to talk about the impact of disability and needing changes to make society far more accessible for these people when they win the medals and when they have the media interviews that exclusively the Paralympics offer. But secondly, it gives those from developing countries an opportunity to talk about the plight of poverty in their country, something that only Olympics, where they're able to engage, does. Finally, thirdly, it provides a tool for diplomacy. We think when we can ban South Africa for the Olympics during the apartheid and put pressure on the government to change when it's such a global event and everyone wants to be involved, that's a really valuable tool for international diplomacy that they forego on their side of the house. Before I move on, I'll take the POI.
Okay, so you talked about how people are suddenly going to get global unity if they interact with other tourists at the Olympic Village. If what they instead see is just like a bunch of poverty in that country and go back and report badly, how is this good for global unity at all?
Look, I think we explained detailed earlier in my speech why we're not going to see as much of that poverty under our side of the house, why we're changing the direction of the Olympics. Secondly, let's take a look at how we improve the sporting environment, firstly, on a global level. Because we tell you on their side of the house, sport becomes dominated by a few big sports, like non-Olympic sports that already have big World Cups like cricket, rugby and football. Sports of the colonialists are the ones that stay. Sports, small niche sports like specific athletic events or canoeing, those are the things that get shut out under their side of the house, so you create a lack of diversity in sports. But secondly, it makes it a lot harder for developing countries to compete internationally because they don't get sponsorship that comes from having an Olympic team from Nike or from like an Adidas or another big company. That means they're far less able to compete in other big events, but it also means that the lots of regional events that they get on their side of the house often excludes developing countries. Because when you have the European Championship, that means you exclude people in Africa, people from South America. That's not making sport inclusive. But if we look at on the individual country level, we think domestically, people are just less active. There's far less of an interest in sport under their side of the house because you don't have the huge publicisation of sports events that you get with the Olympics. You don't have the role models with the big names. You don't have those sporting development programs provided by Olympic programs. So proud to support the development of all sport, proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and will now invite up the second affirmative speaker from Wellington Gold, Sophie.
Olympics was created to foster global unity and to promote friendly sports competitions. But when a country like Russia uses their state technology to cheat by having their athletes dope, we lose the good nature of the sport. And this is unique only to the Olympics because countries know it is a way to rebrand themselves on the global stage. They know that 1 billion people are watching compared to a sport like FIFA, where significantly less, like maybe 300 million would be watching. So they're more likely to use all of their state resources, all of their funding to try and cheat the system so they can show the best version of themselves. That is the difference with the Olympics today. It is the biggest sporting competition, so it is blown up to the extreme, and countries would do anything to prove themselves in a good global manner. So what am I going to prove to you today? Firstly, I'm going to give you clarifications around why the Olympics is a unique sporting competition. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about why the corruption ruins the friendliness of the sport competition. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about why the Olympics actively harms the economy of these nations. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how on our side, we still get well-engaged sports without this corruption. So first, let's quickly address why the Olympics is unique to other sports competitions. I kind of weighed this in my intro, just talking about how all nations of the world are participating, lots of people are watching, and we think it's just the most invested in competition. So compared to something like the Commonwealth Games, although it has lots of countries participating, we understand that this is the biggest way for these countries to expose themselves and show their image. So they're more incentivized on our side of the house and to go and have corruption to ensure that they have a good global image, particularly for countries who are very authoritarian and want to show themselves in a very good light so they can get Soviet support or something on our side of the house. So then let's look at my first point on why the corruption ruins the friendliness of the competition. And I think this is a point that we first characterized why we will always have corruption on our side. Because what they basically told us at First NEG is that these committees will learn from their mistakes and improve by them. Firstly, we respond to this by saying that because these countries are on the world stage, they will go out of their way, regardless of any regulation, to ensure that they can cheat the system. That is why the Russia doping scandal occurred. They had a separate body to ensure that doping didn't happen at the Olympics, but they spent years and money into developing technology so they can cheat the system. This shows us that countries, no matter how corrupt they are going to find ways to cheat the system, and they can't prevent that. And we know they're uniquely incentivized to do that because there are 1 billion people watching, and they know that they will get this global attention that may paint them in a different light, and they can push up their image and propaganda. Secondly, then, let's talk more about the Olympic body itself. We'd say that often they select countries 10 years before, so sometimes they don't know what type of economic situation they're going to be in. This is a huge harm in today's debate because it means that if that country suddenly has an overturning government and goes corrupt, we feel like this is going to impact the way they operate the games. But we'd also state under this that even if these Olympic bodies have the best intentions of selecting a good country to host, sometimes they're just going to have to let them get away with corruption. That is why we've had so many Olympic scandals like Rio, like with China, like with Russia, and it's because they can't stop everything. It is hard for these bodies to prevent anything, and they will just try to do the minimum because the first thing they're interested in is making these games happen. So now that we understand that, why is the corruption ruin the friendliness of the competition? Basically, what we have heard from NEG is how this whole competition unites the world. 3 responses to this. Firstly, we just say that generally this corrupt nature actually ruins this level of unity because when Russia is caught out for doping, we think we generally get discrimination to all Russian citizens and they're labelled as this, and then we get hate from the rest of the world to this group of people. But also we'd say it exacerbates existing tensions between countries. For example, if one country cheats, another is more likely to call them out, and we have more tension here. This is the harm we bring to you on our side. Secondly, then we'd say that the overly competitive nature also creates animosity. Because it is a really high level sporting competition, athletes are more likely to break out into fights. We're more likely to have splits in sides, and this creates world tension because one person might stand by one athlete and another country may stand behind another, and we have this global conflict in that terms. But even then, if we take them at their best and they say that they are able to unite people, we say we can do that on our side with the Commonwealth Games and FIFA. But the difference is we have less corruption on our side because it's more manageable when it's not as high scale. But also we think it has less harm to the economy because you're not building like a 35 billion stadium. You're more likely to build like a 15 billion stadium. That is the difference on our side of the house. Finally, then we just heard stuff about how like tourists can interact, and that's how we improve unity. Firstly, we'd say that likely these tourists are like rich people from like Britain and the UK, so we don't get that much diversity of people. And secondly, we'd say that like they go back to the country and talk about how this country is very poor. I'll actually take you a minute, and this is horrible for this country. Yes, I'll take you.
Okay, so surely someone's going to see poverty in a country and actually go back and say, this is something that needs to be addressed, this is change we need to make, rather than saying, ooh, poverty.
No, because often they're like rich, privileged people who are going to go, oh, that's an awful state. Don't want to go back and travel there. That is what happens under the status quo. Finally, then they talked about how like coverage brings light to these world issues. Firstly, we'd say that what actually happens is it makes these governments running the Olympics more have more brutality to like these minority groups. For example, they're going to try and cover up these issues more by like locking away the Uyghur people in China. This is more harm than today's debate because they are harming these minorities more. But secondly, then we'd say that even if they bring this light to these issues at the Olympics, at the end of the day, it's always going to be undercovered by the big sporting event of like the athletes going on their like run or their track meet. And at the end of the day, they're always going to have the ski article first in the news over the Uyghur people being discriminated against. That is the difference in the world. Finally, then, why is the Olympics actively harming the economy? All we heard to this is we came out and told you at first that what happens is these countries have massive debt and then they have to deal with it in 5 years in the future because now the economy is suffering and now they don't have sufficient healthcare. Basically, they said this only happens in like Rio. We think this happens in London too. 2 reasons. Firstly, we'd say it applies to all nations. For example, London also cares about like global power, trade relations. So they're more likely to move homeless people off the street too. It applies to all these countries. They're going to like get rid of ghettos, bowl them down because they want a good global image. We say that all countries would rather have the sport over supporting their people. And that is the issue in today's debate with the Olympics specifically, is because it's so blown up, they're willing to sacrifice their people for this ridiculous sporting community. We can't stand by that. But secondly, we'd say then that these developed nations also put sports before well-being. We don't support that. Finally then, why do we still get engaged in sport on our side? Basically, they told us this point about like unique sports like canoeing aren't going to be broadcasted as much. We already answered that in like our first speaker speech, just saying that like, look, they already currently have their own platform, people probably fund them who are really invested in that sport anyway. That group who is interested in watching it will find a way to go watch that sport. But also we'd say that even if it's at the Olympics, not many people are watching that sport anyway, so we don't think that has significant harm. What we do today is we show you this corruption is too significant when it comes to uniting the world, but we also show you we are actively harming these countries. We can't stand by this.
Awesome. I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and we'll now welcome up the second speaker from Auckland Road.
So at Affirmative have picked Rio as the hill that they chose and the hill that they will die on. They have not acknowledged any of the material that we have brought to you about the international collaboration, the actual benefits that we get based off the Olympics, and having this huge platform for niche sports, for smaller developing countries, and for engagement on the global scale. They have stuck to their guns and they haven't developed their case at all, and this is why we win this debate. In this speech, I'm going to address the three main points of clash that have arisen in this debate. Firstly, why we have a greater global platform with the Olympics for global change. Secondly, how it can actually improve economies and whether economies will be drastically crippled by the Olympics. And finally, on the quality of sports and why we get a better quality of sports in general, before I move on to my substantive contribution about how abolishing the Olympics is incredibly detrimental to athletes. So on this first point about why we have less of a global platform for global change. So firstly, they kept saying that things will be swept under the rugs and human rights abuses such as Rio abolishing like slums and districts with huge numbers of people living in them will get absolutely no coverage, while using Rio, an incredible international scandal that got a huge deal of international recognition. They also said that things such as like Rio will go completely unnoticed, and this will actually support them in their human rights abuses because authoritarian governments are able to sweep their actual horrendous crimes under the guise of the Olympics. We tell you that actually the exact opposite happened when Berlin was boycotted with cases such as this, and we can actually hold countries to account based off the Olympics because this has such a huge international audience. They've admitted to us the gravitas of the Olympics. You don't get this with a smaller competing sports events. You only get this with the Olympics. When people actually engage with the Olympics, people have an invested sentimental interest in the Olympics, and therefore people will actually engage with this and the human rights abuses that these countries are actually engaging in. Secondly, they said that poverty, although they will be actually seen, isn't actually given a global platform under the Olympics, that these smaller developing countries are always going to be swept under the rug. We tell you that when you have these athletes actually competing at this global scale in a way that you don't have when you have European championships, when you have like the FIFA World Cup, that's only one sport. When you have these countries actually competing on a sport that they're actually really competitive at and can compete at the same or even a higher level to these developed countries, you get more interest in them. And even if you see the poverty that goes on in this, because of the global state that it is, they wanted to characterize that people will completely ignore all the poverty that is going on in these countries. This is simply not true. These people will actually engage, and this brings to light the key problems about the developing world. This brings to light the international relations and this creates a huge amount of diplomacy that cannot be ignored. Secondly, how can this actually improve the economy? We gave you structural reasons at ISAC, which wasn't engaged with by the second speaker. However, we'll run through them again. Firstly, they told us that because it's a huge sugar rush and only rich people are actually going to come to these Olympics, that this isn't actually that much of an economic benefit for these countries. We told you at ISAC, firstly, that when you have this international competition taking place in your country, you have families coming to the Olympics in a way that's unique to the Olympics. This is made to be a family vacation that people actually do come to, and also their characterization of only rich people coming to the Olympics is completely wrong. You have grants and prizes to go to the Olympics. This is made up to be a huge event. A lot of people save up to go to the Olympics, and this has a huge impact on these economies. Secondly, we also gave you multiple structural reasons as to why the Olympics are actually getting better and learning from their mistakes, such as the Olympic Committee actually recognizing these flaws in the past and creating better structural reforms to actually improve the Olympics and the economic benefits. I'll take you.
Why does it matter how many tourists you get if you just spend $50 billion building a stadium that you're never going to use again?
Firstly, I'd like them to bring an example of a $50 billion stadium. And secondly, I'd like to also say that when you have this influx of tourism to a completely unrecognized country that's never had this sort of tourism industry before, this is a huge long-term industry that they can actually benefit off. We think we get all those harms. They haven't claimed any of these benefits on their side. Finally, on the quality of sport, they said that corruption and doping is going to be inherent to the Olympics and it's unique to the Olympics. Why is this not true? Firstly, we've told you at ISAC that the Olympics has hugely structured doping mechanisms, and when countries are caught for being doping, Russia is being excluded from the Tokyo Olympics for this scandal. It's much worse in competitions such as the Tour de France, which are smaller competitions. And we also told you that along their case, they didn't really bring any inherent harms that are specific and unique to the Olympics. They only gave us things such as doping doping and corruption, which happen anyway, especially to a higher degree in these European competitions. They said that this is because countries will do anything to win. At the Olympics, we tell you that this is the exact same in any sporting competition whatsoever, and that any competition will actually do whatever they have to do to win. We don't think that this is a unique benefit. They don't claim any of the benefits, such as the global platform that the gravitas of the Olympics actually gives to these countries. They only claim that these small harms that we've proven to you exist for every sporting competition on this in the world actually only exist for the Olympics. They can't claim this. They've lost all these points. Before I move on to my split, I'll take another point of information if you have one.
So for countries with human rights abuses, why wouldn't they just sweep them under the rug, and why do they get this change, given that we've seen a lot of countries with human rights abuses not get changed?
Firstly, why wouldn't any other sporting competition do this exactly the same? And secondly, like we've told you all the way down the line, that these human rights abuses are not actually swept under the rug. They're held to an incredible amount of international scrutiny, and the amount of international scrutiny is actually enough for these people to actually stop these human rights abuses. We've seen this in South Africa with the apartheid. We've seen this in Soviet Russia. We've seen this in Berlin. We don't think we need to give you any more examples to get this point across clearly enough. Okay, moving on to the idea of how abolishing the Olympics has unique harms to the athletes. Firstly, on this point, it crushes the mental health of these athletes. We've seen with 1 year of pushback of Tokyo, the amount of detriment that this has actually had on athletes who have trained for 4 years under extreme regimens to actually prepare themselves for Tokyo. Imagine now a child who's literally had their entire childhood sacrificed for the dream of being an Olympic athlete, a child who's had no hobbies, who has had no friends outside of this because of the incredibly brutal regimen that Olympic athletes actually go under. These children are now, who have watched the Olympics since they were literally 7 or 8, to actually create ambition for themselves and goals. See the Olympics actually destroyed, and their goals and aspirations are crushed. This is incredibly detrimental for the mental health of these athletes. And secondly, it actually detriments the long-term generational engagement in sport, because people see that when you invest everything you have into a sport that you're truly passionate about, because of something like this, the abolition of an incredibly important international competition can occur. We think that this is incredibly detrimental. Secondly, we want to focus specifically on female athletes and niche sports. They basically told us that because of the Olympics, no one watches these niche sports such as croquet, that they don't matter. However, we tell you that this is one of the key points, because this is the only platform that these small niche sports actually get to compete on the international scale. Isaac told you that these sports, without the Olympics, become rich white people sports, and without this actually doesn't get any benefit. But why do we see specific harm to female athletes? In the world that the affirmative team won, female athletes get disproportionately less screen time, and they're not seen as true athletes. In the Olympics, when you have niche sports such as figure skating and gymnastics, you see that women can be incredible sports people without having to be one of the football players or the basketball players that they stand for. Secondly, you also have smaller niche sports like shot put, where women are actually viewed with a lot of interest in these sporting areas, and they are shown to be incredibly competitive. Finally, why are athletes never able to actually self-actualize and reach their sporting goals? These people are never going to actually be able to gain to reach the peaks of their sporting achievement, because they're not going to actually be able to train for these 4-year regimens and not have these ideologies of achievement. For these reasons, I'm so proud to negate, and we believe that this is an incredibly important sporting platform.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and we'll now welcome up the third affirmative speaker, Tara.
To leave solving the harms of the Olympics up to some rich, benevolent British tourist who gets home from Brazil and says, wow, we really have to do something about that developing world poverty, don't we? This is just simply not actually this is the way to solve this poverty. We get a much better solution on our side of the house. We want to permanently ban the Olympics. 3 things I'm going to tell you today. Firstly, I'm going to tell you how all Olympics will harm the country that is hosting in significantly bad ways. Then I'm going to tell you how the Olympics just harms sports and sport as a general, including athletes. And then I'm going to tell you how the Olympics harms international relations and like social justice issues, which we heard from the negating side of the house. Okay, so let's look at how Olympics always harms the country that's hosting. We told you from first that there's this massively big issue of countries being willing to sacrifice like billions of dollars so they can get some sort of like international like clout that they can get from like hosting the Olympics, right? They just really want this like to look really cool and powerful because they can build all of these stadiums, and that's why they want to do that. But we told you that this is really harmful. It is not just harmful in Brazil where they want to build those favelas. It is also harmful in London where they replace like buildings where they could put like productive community buildings like libraries or schools, and they replace them with like stadiums that are barely used when they already have adequate stadiums there, and at the same time they like shove homeless people out of their streets. This still happens in developed countries. What we had from the negating side of the house is that like, well, Olympics can be like a cool family vacation thing, and like they will find out about some cute unrecognized country. Okay, couple lines of responses to this. First of all, countries that host the Olympics are not unrecognized countries that no one has any idea you can tour to. Everyone here knows about Brazil before the 2016 Olympics. Everyone here knows about China. Everyone here knows about London. Everyone in the entire world knows about Tokyo, right? So we don't see that hosting the Olympics means you get like all of this great like publicity in terms of like a country that people can actually visit. Like this isn't the first time that people hear about Brazil because they're hosting the Olympics. That is simply not the case. And as for whether like the Olympics can be some family vacation, first of all, we don't really think it is a family vacation. Like these are just like really loud arenas. You especially don't take young children there, right? And then secondly, even if it was, it's just like, these families are just like not going to be enough for these to replace all of these like billions that they spent on infrastructure, right? They spend an incredible amount of money on clearing their lands, on building up stadiums, on doing this stuff so that they can host these Olympics, and any money that they get from family vacations is like literally just not going to be enough for this. So what happens is that the country goes into debt. We have all of the harms that we told you happen on our side of the house, and they do not fix this on their side of the house. Okay, and then there was also about these human rights abuses that we told you are really, really harmful. So the side Neg just said that like people will will know about like any human rights abuses in Brazil because of the Olympics, but by the same mechanism that I just told you before, people already know about these countries, right? And so actually, these countries know that they're going to be in the spotlight. They're going to be willing to shove people into these corners to put all of this money into hiding these human rights abuses because they'll get called out for that. And at that, even if they do get called out for these human rights abuses, people don't really do anything about it, right? Because who's the classic person who goes to the Olympics? It's someone who really, really values sport, someone who really values this good competition, and they don't really want politics getting involved in sport. And whether like human rights abuses are actually a political thing is not what we're talking about here, but people see it as a thing, right? People think that discussing whether a country should be allowed to host the Olympics is quite a political thing, especially when they want to shut down the Olympics. Because of that gets people really upset. And so people won't bother to be calling out these human rights abuses. So nothing would get done, right? So our solution to these human rights abuses, the only solution to these human rights abuses is to not have the Olympics, right? And then I just also want to say that when China was occupying Tibet and committing human rights abuses there, they still hosted the Olympics. So we actually don't have any examples of Neg fixing this issue on that side of the house. Okay, how Olympics harm sports. Oh, sorry. What we know at the end of that is that the Olympics is just really, really harmful to the countries that are hosting in terms of, firstly, they get put into massive debt when they should be spending that money elsewhere. And secondly, they have all these awful human rights abuses that Neg cannot fix. How Olympics harm sports. Firstly, let's talk about niche sports. This is just not a big part of this debate. I mean, if countries really only compete in niche sports like croquet or whatever, if they're at the Olympics, if they're super good at it, right? And that just means that it's a really big source of national pride. So they'll keep funding it after the Olympics. Okay, so that's just a silly thing. We don't think it's really big in this debate, and we don't think it really matters. As for athletes, they spoke about how like it crushes your mental health to not have the Olympics. You know what crushes your mental health more? Training your entire life so that you can get to the Olympics and then just like not winning that gold medal because it's once every 4 years and you can't do it. What we have on our side of the house is that people can still get glory through these great smaller competitions that we still have that still bring in the spirit of sport, but don't cause you to literally like destroy your body so that you can do this. They don't require like China to have like secret Olympic training camps where they handpick 6-year-olds from primary school so that they can train them for the rest of their lives for only one of them to be picked to go to the Olympics. We don't have people destroying their mental health, destroying their bodies for the Olympics because we just don't think it is as important as people make it out to be. And then quickly, just about like poor countries being able to compete in the Olympics. This doesn't really change funding for poor countries, like for example, track and field, right? That really doesn't cost anything. You just have to have a flat area. And for cross country, you don't even have to have a flat area, right? You don't really need funding for that, yeah? Okay, and then poor countries also don't have the money to like go and fly halfway across the world to send their athletes to go compete at the Olympics. They can really only compete if the Olympics are local. So African nations really only compete at the Olympics if the Olympics are in like either somewhere close to them. So this is just like in Africa or in like Western Asia, you know, that kind of place, right? So we don't really see that as a big deal. And then I'm going to tell you about how the Olympics harms international relations. Oh, sorry. What we know from that is that we still get a really great preservation of sport, and we still have this great environment whilst we don't have all of these harms like debt and human rights abuses. And I'll take a POI.
I think everyone in this room agrees that Brazil has been humiliated by hosting the Olympics. Why would any rational country want to do it when Brazil clearly didn't get any clout?
Because countries are just going to hide it. Like countries are going to be willing to like just take this risk, right? They think there's some big, powerful international person who can take this on. That's why they host this Olympics, because they care so much about that. Countries are like countries, especially like China or the United States, right? And like I'm gonna be straight up, they're just like pretty vain, right? Like they're pretty full of themselves, and they're like, maybe Brazil couldn't do it, but they're like a developing country. We can hide those human rights abuses, and they're going to be willing to do it so that they can get all of that publicity and that tourism that they think is so beneficial to them. And then the Olympics, as we've told you, harms international relations and issues, right? We can get social justice issues, actions otherwise. It's not only through the Olympics. This isn't in like irrelevant countries. They're in countries that we already know. They're in China. They're in like the UK, right? So it's not really that different. And countries are just going to keep on like doing doping because, like I said, I just told you before, they're pretty vain. They think they can get away with it. And not to mention, drugs are like always like exponentially expanding, right? They're always getting better and better. So there's always going to be ways to bypass this. This is inevitable exclusively with the Olympics because of the mechanisms that we set out on why it is so prestigious, why this is so important. We stand for removing countries from putting themselves in debt, from allowing human rights abuses to occur, just for a measly bit of international glory.
I'd like to thank the speaker for this speech, and we'll now welcome up the final substantive speaker for today, from Auckland Blue, Jack.
Side Affirmative wanted to make their main push in today's debate about host countries and the human rights abuses and the fact that they commit these. Not only did we prove that this doesn't happen in the majority of cases, but we also gave you detailed analysis on how our model works against this and how this is unlikely to happen after Rio. But a final line of response here, even if you don't accept any of that material and want to ignore all of our speeches today, we can all recognize that it would be incredibly dumb for a country that has human rights abuses, that is trying to hide human rights abuses, to host the biggest sporting event in the world and highlight all their human rights abuses. Like happened with Rio, they tried to say they sweep it under the rug, but literally used an example of a very popular use of these human rights abuses. 3 main points of clash for you in today's debate. But firstly, how do we win this debate? So we have won today's debate if we can prove to you that we get the best global change in today's debate, and if we can prove that we actually save sport and save the development of it throughout, proving one of these two to win today's debate. So 3 points of clash to do this. Firstly, why we get better global change. Secondly, why we create a better sporting environment. And then thirdly, why we actually benefit the economy. So firstly, onto global change. So they wanted to talk about abolishing the Olympic Games due to it not achieving its goals. 3 responses. Firstly, it's just not true, right? It has achieved the goal of achieving a lot of global unity. You've seen events that have united many countries. It's brought many more countries into the international sphere and been able to compete. But also another goal of it is to improve sport and its outreach and its publicity and improve and develop lots of different sports. It's undoubtedly done this and therefore has achieved its goals. Secondly, it's still achieved a huge global outreach, which means we think it has succeeded in this way. But thirdly, that doesn't mean to abolish it, right? Essentially, this point just becomes contingent on them proving that it's actually harmful and doesn't matter in today's debate. So now moving on to this. The next big key push on this point was about cheating in the Olympics and how it was a huge problem and a mutually exclusive problem to the Olympics. And the outcome of this was it harms the friendly nature of sports. 4 responses. Firstly, it happens in many sports. As we told you at second, the worst instance of this is probably in the Tour de France, which is much less coverage. It's a specific sport that only is watched by one set of fans, cyclist fans, but it happens much worse. We actually think that there's lots of incentives for this to happen. There's always an incentive to win in sport. There's always prize money. It isn't just in the Olympics where you really want to win. But secondly, we think that the reason it's less than the Olympics is because it's so big, right? As we told you at first, there's a huge amount of anti-doping technology, and there's new boards to actually regulate this. We think you are far less likely to get it at an event like the Olympics, which is far bigger, can commit far more funds to it. But but thirdly, it's not that big a problem, right? Let's weigh it up against getting huge global outreach, huge global change. That's clearly more important. And fourthly, sport is not all about the friendly nature, right? At the Olympics, you're there to compete. It's highly competitive. It's not about being really friendly, although we do get friendships built between countries. So they then wanted to talk about how fights break out between athletes, which cause tension between athletes. 2 responses. Let's just have a sense check at this point in the debate, right? Firstly, fights don't usually break out between athletes, but secondly, countries don't usually go to war because 2 athletes from opposing countries had a little bit of a scrap on the rugby field, right? This was a pretty ridiculous point. They then wanted to say that they got global change from the FIFA World Cup and Commonwealth Games. Now this point was music to my ears. 2 responses as to why. Firstly, as they characterised, these events aren't that big, right? They said that the Olympics is the one big event that has this gravitas and why it's so exclusive from other sports. And so we think they can't get global change from these events. But secondly, even if they are big, even if we accept this, they're exclusionary sports, right? The FIFA World Cup is only football, so you're only looking at one sport and also excludes countries. And the Commonwealth Games is only countries in the Commonwealth, right? It's excluding a whole bunch of countries, not nearly the same outreach, right? Even if they win all this material, they don't get the benefit because they never really explained to us what their benefit was here, right? They wanted to say that they get less poverty and things like that, but Brazil was is a country that already was in a lot of poverty. They don't actually lift countries out of poverty. They don't create any change or any betterment for these countries. We actually do create betterment and change. Our material here really went through uncontested. It was really good material. We brought you right down the line about how we create global change, the reach of the Olympics, and it never really was contended with. I'll take a POI now.
Okay, so we told you why we stop this extra poverty from occurring. Even London didn't break even. How do you guys stop this extra poverty?
Okay, sure. You're saying that you stop extra poverty. What I'm saying is that Brazil was already in a really bad economic situation. You don't actually have a benefit here to help that country out of poverty. We gave you plenty of regulations on why these countries won't host in the future. London was actually really benefited by the Olympics in many ways. As we told you, we're not going to engage with that anymore. Secondly, onto the sporting world and how this helps it. So we think that international sport becomes dominated by rich white sports that have huge non-Olympic competitions under the status quo. What does this mean? It makes it harder for the developing world to compete. Firstly, because they don't have the sponsorships, they don't have that funding coming in from big sponsors like your Nikes, like your Adidas, that get you that money to have funding. Secondly, they're excluded from regional competitions because it's just far harder to have Africa involved in the Euros, and obviously by name they're not going to be involved in that, and so they are excluded in this way.
On that.
People are less active as many sports. The outcome of this is that people are less active as many sports that would have been
On that.
played do not exist without the Olympics. You have no role models for these people. You have
On
the
that.
Olympic development programs to nurture and encourage this at a grassroots level on our side of the house, but those fall by the wayside on their side of the house, which is a really big harm. They then said that these niche sports didn't matter. Why do they? Two responses. Firstly, we think it's makes it fair internationally, as different countries have different chances to compete in different sports. You have countries like Jamaica, which have become really big, or countries like Kenya, or short distance or long distance running, and that has really helped the nation to become more on the global stage. But secondly, you just create such inequality in sport, right? You have the big colonial countries playing the big colonizing sports, and that's all you really get, right? You get rugby, cricket, the traditional colonizing sports, and you do not get these sports that were brought from other parts of the world. We then had a fantastic split at HISO, and the only response we heard here was that it's more crushing to not get that medal. However, it's a lifelong dream of many to compete at the Olympics and just get there, and also at least they get closure at that point. It's really great for them to get that. We clearly think it's better to actually be able to have the chance to fulfill your dreams and compete than not have that chance at all. Now moving on to the third point about the economy. So they wanted to talk about host countries and how they get in a really bad financial situation. 4 responses. Firstly, we modelled in sustainability checks into our model. This was something they never directly engaged with. This thinks we're going to look at the viability for these countries long term. We won't have countries like Brazil hosting. Secondly, though, most of the time it isn't Rio, right? We think it's more like London, Sydney, countries and cities like that get benefits from hosting. Thirdly, we think these developing countries will learn from their mistakes, they'll learn from Rio and think it's probably not a good idea to host a big tournament while we're still developing. But fourthly, on human rights abuses, they said the incentive was there to sweep it under the rug. But this doesn't matter, right? As they proved that this was never going to get swept under the rug by giving us a big example of human rights abuses that clearly did not get swept under the rug, right? It's really dumb to host, as I told you in my intro, if you commit these abuses. They then wanted to talk about tourism, that countries already know about these countries, but a big event comes on and people will flock to that country. And also we think that people save up for 4 years to go to the Olympics. It's not just rich people, otherwise it wouldn't sell out. At the end of the debate, we decided that actually brings global change. We have a clear outcome, we have a clear benefit. Proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech. We'll now welcome up the negation team's reply, delivered by Isaac.
To win this debate, SciDAF couldn't just say that sometimes the Olympics aren't very fair because people cheat. Because the Olympics are far more than that, and they have a far bigger impact on the entire globe. This debate is not about whether one gold medal every Olympics goes to someone who doped. This debate is about how we can achieve fundamental global change using the Olympics as a huge platform. That is where the biggest impact lies in today's debate. That is what this debate has come down to. 3 points of clash, therefore. Firstly, who gets the most global change, whether you've got the Olympics or not. Secondly, how a host country is affected by the Olympics. And thirdly, whether the Olympics has a net positive effect on the quality of sport internationally and domestically. Firstly, let's take a look at global change, because we gave you multiple mechanisms as into how we achieve this global change. We told you we create cross-nation, cultural and national relations. We told you we create a platform for social change that's provided by the Olympics and the amount of attention it's given. The real implicit response to this down the line was that they get it with other competitions too. Crucially, this missed the structural mechanisms that we gave you at first, that told you why the Olympics specifically could do this, about how much coverage you get, about how many people attend it and actually go to the village. And we tell you, yes, maybe it is predominantly people from richer countries, but we think things like Olympic grants to help people travel can help people move and be mobile and get to the Olympics. But finally, we told you it's the only truly global event, and that makes it particularly beneficial for achieving these aims. I want to also point out that all our material we gave you about the Olympics being used as a tool for diplomacy, like how we addressed apartheid in the 20th century, didn't receive a response from that side of the House. That still stands at this point of the debate. The only real response in terms of international relations was that tensions between countries can break out when corruption or fights lead. But we told you down the line that countries don't base all of their diplomacy on just whether one person cheated in a game. We think they're more rational than that. Why is this the most important part of this debate? A couple of reasons. Firstly, because of the magnitude of impact this has on the entire world environment. This is about international relations and whether we can help developing countries, whether we're able to have stable international relations. But secondly, we tell you there's a greater certainty of this impact because we've seen it be used for a tool for social change in the past with things like Tommy Carlos and the Black Power movement. There is a certainty to getting this global change. That's why it's so important. Then let's take a look at host countries. What did they say? They said there's a huge economic harm. If we take their best case, if we look at our best case scenario, we say success examples like London show that tourism means that it can actually be net positive. But even if we look at their worst case, we say that we've put things in our case that reduces the harm of this, like having to assess the financial stability of countries, like having cross-funding between local countries and sharing the Olympics, like countries just being less likely to host after finding out the failure of Brazil. Then they told us that these countries are able to sweep human rights abuses under the rug, and this exacerbates human rights abuses. Firstly, we tell you they never clearly step through how it actually exacerbates it or makes it worse under their side of the house. But secondly, we tell you it's far harder to do this if they choose to host the Olympic Games. We think the amount of public pressure and publicity that you get from this is going to reduce their ability to do that. Finally, if we look at sport, we told you that developing countries are shut out of sport under their side of the house, and people just get less active because crucial sports that they might have been interested in under their side of the house no longer exist, no longer get the same coverage. The only response onto sport was that people cheat so sport doesn't become competitive. But we've told you down the line that the amount of attention that you get at the Olympics is going to reduce your ability to do this, and the state of modern technology will too. So proud to support sport and international relations. Proud to oppose.
Sweet. I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and we'll now welcome up the final speech of the day, the affirmative reply delivered by Sophie.
The Olympics was designed to be an event that created friendly relations and united all countries on all fronts. What we had to show to you today was that this gets destroyed when we have this high level of corruption that is unique to the Olympics, but also this damage the economy for both the host countries and the countries sending out their athletes. This is the harm we presented to you today. We successfully proved this, and that is how we won today's debate. 3 points of clash we had today. First, we talked about why the corruption ruins the unification of the competition. Secondly, we talked about why the Olympics actively harms the economy of these nations. And then finally, we talked about why we still get engaged sport on our side. So firstly, why the corruption ruins the unification of the competition. What we told you that is unique to the Olympics is that it's always going to have some level of corruption that they can't prevent, no matter how many regulations they put in about anti-doping, no matter how many bodies they have to check to ensure that it goes according to plan. We understand that we're going to have this change. And we heard this and we understand this because, for example, by their own mechanism, we got told that these boards would learn from their mistakes. But we asked you then, why did we have the same repetition of Beijing, of Rio, of Russia, where they all had minorities being oppressed during the Olympic Games? It continues because some sometimes this event is so extravagant and out of hand that you can't control every detail. And that is the issue we've brought to you today that leads to this corruption and these minorities being oppressed. We can't stand by that. But we also told you today that basically what happens is these countries find new ways to cheat and they adapt in different ways. That's why Russia got away with its doping scandal, because it figured out a way to cheat the system. We understand that technology evolves, and that is how we prove that point. So at this, we understand that even though Beijing has human rights abuses, its patriotic views of it leads it into wanting to host the Olympics, because it views itself as like this big national global leader will go and host the Olympics. And then we have these issues like corruption. Secondly, then under this point, we talked about uniting the world, which is basically the entirety of Sidemead's case. We clearly responded to this by saying, look, this level of corruption creates fights and creates distance between countries and discrimination. And this is just clear that this is not unification, showing us once again that our path to victory of having unification isn't achieved on their side. Finally, then they just talked about how on their side, they can bring light to corruption within these sports. We said that firstly, this is always going to be covered up by the sporting event itself. But we also told you that if this debate was on getting social progress, change, we definitely wouldn't do it through sport, because we always know that the sporting community is going to be put first. At the end of this entire point around corruption, we understand that things like cheating scandals around fights and animosity means that we are ruining this image of unification. It is something that is only extreme the Olympics, because so many billions of people watching it, and that is the harm we are getting rid of today. Secondly, then, on why the Olympics actively harms the economy of nations. We told you clearly at first that countries face massive debt, regardless if they're a developed nation, like a place like London or Rio. And this is because it just takes billions of dollars to build new train stations, to build new stadiums. So basically, they said to us that the tourism can counteract that. But we told you that even with their high-level tourism, you still can't replace this debt and handling the economy. But they also said that they had these checks to ensure that these the country can handle this much pressure and debt on the economy. But we told you no matter what country it is, it probably won't be able to handle this debt because it is so significant. At the end of this point, we understand that these countries are putting sport over the well-being of their citizens. We can't support that. We don't stand by corruption. We don't stand by hurting minorities. So proud to affirm.
Awesome. I'd like to thank both teams for a great debate. I'll invite you to cross the floor and shake hands, and I will turn off the live stream. I'm sorry, Sam. I'm sorry. I should have
Low, low volume.